Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. Here's a question. How are you feeling about yourself? Now, having answered that for yourself, how are you feeling about your country? What direction is your country on as compared to the direction you think you're on or you feel you're on? Why am I starting the show this way? Because, interestingly, the answer to those two questions kind of sit at the center of our orientation to political satisfaction, institutionally and otherwise. How do I know that? Well, because our guest this week is going to walk us through that and many other value questions that sort of go to the core of our sense of where our country's heading, where it's been, and how we feel about this transition period. Dante Chinni is our special guest. He's with the American Communities Project, and they have done some amazing work, and we're going to spend the entire hour talking about it, surveying America, developing, is it 15 geographic areas?
15 community types, yep.
15 community types that are revelatory. That means they reveal things about America in terms of what the people who live in those particular geographic zones think and feel, how they orient themselves to politics, and the answers to those first two questions I asked. How do they feel about themselves, and how do they feel about the country? And before I let Dante introduce himself and get more deeply into this, I want to say one thing. You might say, oh, God, another survey conversation. They're all the same. Let me submit that I don't think that's true in this particular conversation. The survey is of 5,000 Americans, far larger than comparative data sets, which means it's deeper and, I think, has more to chew over. So with that as an introduction, Dante, it's great to have you. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. That's a very kind introduction. Thank you.
So what did you learn about this set of first two questions? How do I feel about myself? How do I feel about my country?
Yeah, we asked it in a way that people often ask about the country, right track, wrong track. We asked, is your life on the right track or on the wrong track? And the way we did it is we asked of these 15 community types we have, and they're really different places. Like some are big, dense urban environments, some are kind of wealthy suburban communities, some are rural, some are college towns, some are military kind of communities, some are Native American communities, African American South. So we asked them these questions. We thought it'll be curious because we have a bunch of data about these places. We know like how they're doing economically, what's happening in them. So we thought it'll be interesting to see the way these people in these communities see their lives and the way they see the country. The interesting thing was, when we asked them about their lives, there was very little difference. Everybody, and again, like some of these communities, if you were to look at the data, they're struggling economically,
yeah,
right? They're not doing great. How's your life? Great. Like you're talking like 88, more than 80%, I believe, in every type said, my life is on the right track. And then, so it's like, wow, this is kind of an amazing finding. Then we scrolled down a little bit further through the survey. We asked them, how's your community? Is it on the right track or the wrong track? And the people said like, well, my community is, 60% in every community. Like, yeah, my community's on the right track. I mean, not as high, but still 60%, more than a majority, a super majority, right? And then we asked them, how about the country? Is the country on the right track or the wrong track? And the numbers just collapsed. They're terrible. I mean, you're talking, I don't think a single community was over 20% of the country's on the right track. So my life is incredible. My community, it's doing pretty well. The country is just, it's a basket case. That was the read of the data. And look, the reason we look at these communities is they're so different. Mm-hmm. We expect, and we do, in other questions in the survey, we see massive differences. But on this question, these series of questions, they aligned. And to us, it was just kind of a startling finding, actually.
And that doesn't typically happen where you get that alignment across communities and across lived experiences, because the lived experience in a densely populated urban area is completely different than the lived experience of a struggling, economically and otherwise isolated or comparatively isolated rural community. Yeah. And yet their orientation to these three questions align.
And their lives are radically different. I mean, we go and visit these places. I mean, look, if you've traveled the country, especially by car, and you get out and see places, life can be very different. We know they're really different. And the idea that there's agreement on these questions was really startling to us, because we know in some of these communities, life hasn't been great over the last 10, 15 years. And so the idea that they all aligned on these questions was really shocking to us. And it was one of the big surprises in the work.
And what should we take from that? What should we try Because I don't think there is a holistic single answer to that,
Right.
but what should we try to absorb from that?
So,
Country's a wreck, I'm doing great.
Right.
Community's doing better than average, country's still a wreck.
right, and in communities where I know they're not doing, I mean, the community itself isn't doing great because I see the data behind it, right? I see the poverty rates, I see the median household income numbers, I see these unemployment numbers. I'm like, wow, these places are struggling. Their lives are great. So, what do I think is going on? I think two things. First, doing the survey is the first part of the work. Once we get the survey done, these are all based on geography. These communities are based on counties. We're going to go and see why the hell does this look the way it does. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think what's really happened is we all live in bubbles, and we live in a bubble community. We live in the bubble we live in. And in the community we live in, you know, day-to-day life is okay. I saw Jim this morning. I saw Bob. Everybody seems like life's good. But then when you ask them about the country, it's the image they perceive of the country over media, over social media.
Right.
And they're just like, ugh, country. It's a disaster. I mean, look, we're in D.C. I mean, if you've been watching any of the coverage about what's going on in Congress, it would make sense to look at some of
Right.
this and say, like, wow, the country's kind of a mess right now.
Right.
But it's deeper than that. I think it's deeper than that. I think that what's really happening is the tribalism that's in these communities and the bubble realities you live in, everything's fine in your bubble. But those people over there in that bubble, they're wrong. And that's one of the problems we have right now.
I want to describe the various communities that you have within this survey and how you break out the data. African American South, aging farmlands, big cities, college towns, evangelical hubs, exurbs, graying America, Hispanic centers, LDS enclaves, middle suburbs, military posts, Native American lands, rural middle America, urban suburbs, working class country. Of those, which do you think need, for my audience, any more explanation?
I think the thing that's probably the hardest thing for people to sort through when they see the typology is we think of rural America as a thing.
All one thing.
Right. It's just like urban places, there's suburban places, and there's rural
It's
places.
one or the other.
Right. And that's, that's something I had a problem with. It's one of the reasons I came up with this project. But it's looking at this poll data and like, well, there's a lot of suburban places and there's a lot of different kinds of rural places, but rural in particular. The difference between like aging farmlands, rural middle America, working class country. These places, if you look at them, you say like, oh, rural places. It's like, yeah, but they're different. Their economies function differently. The size of the communities are different. The
So if I were
range
to
of
think
populations.
conceptually as I'm listening to this, working class country, where is that?
So I think the best way to think of working class country, it doesn't all neatly fit into this, but it's a little more Appalachian in its root. So it's very, very, very small towns, and rural, but not driven by agriculture. Maybe at one time there was some small industry there, something like there was a small plant in town or something like that. So they're places that are kind of like
So
pretty
Ohio,
remote.
parts of eastern Ohio, southeastern Ohio,
Yeah.
West Virginia, some
Yes.
parts of Pennsylvania,
Absolutely.
possibly. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. What would be, I think this one is self-evident, rural middle America.
Right. So I like to think of rural middle America as small town America.
Okay.
So like rural communities a lot of times have these little hubs in them where like everybody goes to do business and things like that. That's rural middle America, those kinds of communities.
Now, graying America, that could be a lot of places.
Yeah, it really could. It tends to be, those are rural places with a large portion of the population that's 65 and over. But they're not agricultural. Increasingly, these places, by the way, just kind of a fascinating side note, they're filling up with retirees and close to retirees who are moving to these places out of urban communities. They're places they visited. They're on the water. They're in the mountains. There's something that like used to vacation there, so they're changing. But like rural, graying, and filling up with different kinds of people.
That is the voice of Dante Chinni. We are at a great restaurant we haven't been to before, kind of all in the family. It is DuPont Italian Kitchen.
Look at
Lunch
that.
has just arrived. We thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Back for segment 2 of the Takeout in just 1 second.
This debate is really about who are we and who do we want to be. And these 15 types that we look at all have different ideas about what they want the country to be.
Welcome back. Lunch is here, and boy, is it good. DuPont Italian Kitchen. Haven't been here before. We'll be back again, I guarantee you. Dante Chinni is our special guest. continuing this conversation about the American Communities Project and what do we know about ourselves? What can we glean about ourselves that's deeper and more fundamental and maybe more helpful to understand politics and maybe our sense of, let me ask you this. I often describe the country politically as more exhausted than active.
Yeah, I think that's
We are participants. Voting data shows that our elections are more involved than they have been. The last 3 elections either set records for turnout or approached records for turnout. And you know as well as I do, because I know you're an expert in this field, in the late 90s, there were all these very important and stern political science articles written about, will democracy die via apathy?
Right.
We don't turn out enough. We're not interested enough. We're not engaged enough. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not a problem anymore.
The parties were too similar, right? That was the other problem in the 90s.
All the similarities.
Brand X and Brand Y.
Why you can't distinguish between the two.
Yeah.
We're all going to collapse from ennui. That's not our issue. Are we exhausted? Is anything in your data try to measure or capture that, or did it push itself into it?
So I will say, from talking to people and looking at some of these numbers, we are exhausted in terms of what are we going to do with this country. Like, we were exhausted about direction, I think, in some ways. Though I will say, like in the survey, get into it a little later, there's some stuff in there where there's more agreement than you'd think in some place. Like, interesting. There's something here maybe. There might be something going on that's worth noting. But the thing that gets everybody geared up right now is, it's like a football Sunday. Everybody puts on their jersey and they go like, they're not even, a lot of times, sometimes they're voting for somebody, a lot of times they're voting against somebody, and that generates enthusiasm. But like, I will say this, the problem is there's not a lot of enthusiasm because in terms of voting for, it used to be in the 90s when things were boring, that we were voting about policies, right? They have a policy and they have a policy, and I'm voting for this policy or for that, or we thought they were. I don't know what voters really vote on, but that's
Look
what we
it up,
thought.
kids. In 2000, there was a lengthy conversation on television even about a lockbox.
The lockbox.
Look it up. I mean, you won't even believe it. You'd be like, "Are you what? People there was like back and forth on."
So it was Social
Cable
Security.
Yeah.
It was just
what
crazy.
to do about the Social Security surplus.
Yeah.
And how tight the lockbox would be.
Yep.
It seems almost absurd now that there was that level of granularity on policy, but there was.
There was, and it's such an antiquated notion now. And I think what's happened is this. People understand that a lot of things have happened. Society moves faster now. Culture moves faster now, in part because of technology and phones and things like this. And like we talked about rural and urban, and this last time we chatted first before the break. The country's not all changing at the same rate. Some places are changing much faster than other places. In fact,
And some parts of the country are more comfortable with the pace of that change.
Exactly. And those things are directly related, I think. And when you look at these numbers all the time about nationally, the country's going to cease to be the country's going to be minority majority, or that's what we used to say. White non-Hispanic people will cease being the majority in this country, and they keep pushing on. I think it's like 2050s, something like that. It's about 63% right now.
Right.
White non-Hispanic. Go to some communities, it's like the 50s. I mean, it's 95% white non-Hispanic, or it's way ahead. It's much more diverse than the nation as a whole. And like, some of these communities look at what's coming down the road, and they're just like, I don't want that. I don't want what's on. I don't want what my kids are showing me on my phone. I don't want the bathroom fights and like things like this. And what does that mean? Well, everybody gets their back up at election time, because we're going to have the fight, we're going to save the country, or no, we're going to take the country in this direction. We all come out and do that, and then the country's pretty evenly divided. Nothing really happens, right? That people can hate Donald Trump or love Donald Trump. He got a lot of votes, right? So a lot of the country is behind him, and a lot of his supporters are in Congress, and so nothing really happens. People get their back up, they think they're going to cast their vote and change the country, and then we just end up in deadlock. So, in my opinion, what do I think? What do we think we're looking at? I think we're looking at 20 years. I think of just this fight going back and forth about what are we going to be who do we want to be? This debate is really about who are we and who do we want to be. And these 15 types that we look at all have different ideas about what they want the country to be. That's the story.
Among these 15, is there a way for you to look at the data and say these are the 2 of the 15 that are most dissimilar?
So in the most
And what would they be? Which are the two that are farthest apart in
would say-
terms of polarities of politics and understanding?
and this is a really crucial point. Like when we built this typology, there is no politics went into this. None. There are no political variables in there. Zero. Like anything we see in the political difference in these places rises out of all the other things that make up the communities. We didn't say like, I want places that vote over 60% Democratic or 60% Republican. We didn't want any of that. So what are the places that are the most different? The big cities are by far the most densely populated. They are the most diverse. They are in some ways what the country is going to become, a lot of these places, in terms of the racial and ethnic mix. I think they're also further ahead in terms of, you look at all sorts of polling data, the decline of people going to church, the rise of nuns, N-O-N-E-S, like no religious affiliation, also in these urban places. What's the opposite of that? The aging farmlands,
Right.
incredibly sparsely populated, very, very, very white, non-Hispanic, very socially conservative. And I mean, like, their social conservatism rises out of the fact that they live in a very different world. Mm-hmm. They live in a world that a lot of us, if you live in an urban area, it doesn't exist anymore. You go to these places, it's like you're in a time warp. It's a different America. Now they still have phones and technology and other things there, but like they really are kind of off in a different world than the big cities. And the big cities, for a lot of people, also are they're America as it's maybe going to be someday, but it's not the way it is now, and that's on people's minds.
And I'm happy to say that this humble little show of my creation lives in both worlds.
Yeah.
We are carried by WCBS in New York and a lovely radio station in Union, Tennessee.
It's important. The one thing that's missing,
And that makes me very happy, by the way.
it's important because the one thing that's missing is there is not a lot of common ground anymore. I mean, the one thing that's happened with the fracturing of media, news media, social media, is where do we all go to get the same? So we talked about how you live in this reality, and if you live in one of these aging farmland communities and then you live in New York City, you're living in different realities. But there used to be, I mean, this is a CBS production, there used to be Walter Cronkite at night.
Yes.
And he would tell
I've
you
heard of him.
the way it was.
Right, yes,
right?
yes.
So now there are a lot
a
of
national
ways.
oracle.
Right, that's right. Now there are a lot of ways it is. And like I think that there is no common kind of national vision of what reality is, which means all these little different kinds of communities that are reading different media and hearing different things and watching different things on TV really develop their own sense of what reality is, and it makes it very hard.
I'm curious about, and we'll carry this conversation on the other side of the break, but I want to get it started now. 2 of the 15 topologies, one is LDS enclaves, and the other is evangelical hubs.
Yes.
What are they, and what makes them different from one another?
So all the data that built this typology is census data, except for 2 sets of data. We actually have religious adherence too. Overall religious adherence, white evangelical population, and LDS population. And why did we do those separately? Because
And LDS is shorthand
I'm sorry,
for...
it's the Mormons.
Right.
And so if you look at it on the map, because we have these all mapped,
Right.
Utah looks a different color than most of the rest of
Right.
the country because of this. Why did we do that? Because those places really do function differently. And the cultural, and it is really interesting. It's like, you'd say like, well, the aging farmlands are conservative too, though, right? It's like, well, they are, but it's not the same. Like these evangelical hubs, when you have a certain percentage of white evangelical population, what does it mean? It means that community is full of a lot of different churches that have a lot of different pastors, and they tend to go to church more often, and they have little groups within the community that have different ideas about what the community should be. Those LDS communities, they have a lot of the same cultural conservatism as those evangelical places, but the difference is in those LDS communities, everybody's LDS, not everybody.
Right.
But most of the people in positions of power in those cities and counties are LDS.
There's a higher degree of homogenization.
Oh, absolutely. It's a different kind of environment.
That is the voice of Dante Chinni. Lunch is here. It's really good. He's got chicken parm. I've got a great creamy pasta thing with chicken and sausage. Excellent. DuPont Italian Kitchen is our location. Back for more, meeting segment 3 in just 1 second.
The differences are there on these cultural conservative questions. They just didn't show up in abortion, which is interesting.
Welcome back. What a delicious lunch here at DuPont Italian Kitchen. Dante Chinni is our guest. I want to ask about these two of the other 15 typologies for places we live in our great country. Three, actually. One is, of the three, I think most self-evident. We'll get to that last. Military posts and Native American lands.
Yeah.
Why those two typologies, and why are they important?
The Native American lands communities, I will say, we've been doing some form of this typology, for 15 years now. And we didn't break them out originally. We had them into a different group. And they just, when you look at the data, they emerge in so many different ways. They pop in so many different ways. Now, they're not always good things, but like those communities really stand out. They're almost always highest unemployment. I will say we did a whole project on deaths of despair, people dying from drugs, alcohol, or suicide. And they blew the curve. I mean, they look different from everything else. They really have special challenges and unique challenges that need to be addressed that aren't true in other communities in the country.
And yet, if I heard your first answer, there's still, on an individual level, a sense that lives are on the right track more than the wrong track.
It's
and
again,
the communities are healthy.
That was one of the things
Net
that jumped
healthy.
out. Yeah, and they're fascinating. Like we get into some of the other questions. The Native American lands are a really interesting mix of like conservative and liberal views. So they're kind of they really are apart from other communities in the country living and seeing the world very differently.
Why is it important to understand politics as it flows through a military post community?
We thought, so the reason we pulled them out, and again, like basically we did this by dumping all this data in and then running it through, like I didn't do this. People smarter than me did this, but like you create an algorithm and just give it to the computer and say, sort these into types, and things emerge. Those emerge, and I think the reason they're interesting to look at is they are conservative. They tend to be fairly rural. Not some cases not, but for the most part, they're transient. People pass through. In fact, in some ways, I think of the military posts as the mirror image of college towns, where it's a lot of young people go there and they're from someplace else, and
Right.
like it's a different kind of like I'm leaving home and becoming an adult in a different sort of way. And so
they're mirror images of each other politically. College
Exactly.
towns more progressive.
Yeah.
Military post.
Exactly. Though the military posts are really interesting because like their view of foreign affairs is just different. I mean, foreign affairs is not just something that's buried in the newspaper, because to them, they look at what's happened in the Middle East or Ukraine.
Or any hotspot.
Any hotspot and wonder, is somebody going there? That's always going to be forefront of their minds. So that makes them fundamentally different. But they are definitely much more conservative than the college towns, which are, again, the flip side. They're young, liberal, on their way to being educated.
Right. And Hispanic centers. How should we think about those?
They're mostly small. They are. They're really interesting because they're mostly, as you would imagine, I will say, like Hispanic centers and the other community of African American South does not mean those places are majority Hispanic or majority African American, but they're much larger than the national average, and they face different kinds of challenges. First of all, they have language barriers in a lot of those communities. They're mostly amassed along in the South along the border, but then you look and they pop up in Kansas. And it's a different kind of population. There are people who come to work the agricultural jobs. Garden City, Kansas is one place that's like this, and I've spent some time there, Finney County. And they're really different because like you have this old white population that's been there a long time, and then this Hispanic population that arrives, and it's different. And there is much more of a symbiotic relationship, I think, in some of these places where like the older white population understands the need, especially in agricultural communities, for having
A labor force.
yeah, they need that. And then along the border, it feels a little different. I will say that just generally those communities, for the most part, their ideas about immigration are different than they are in other places because the Hispanic population is so large in most of those communities that the relationship, everyone's not holding hands and singing Kumbaya, but it's not like they're especially tense. Mm-hmm. There's an understanding that they got to coexist.
So I'll cut to the chase on one of these things. Every one of these 15 typologies does not like inflation. Duh. Okay, given. But let's go a little bit to other issues. Abortion.
Yeah. That was, of all the things in the survey, that was the thing that was personally most surprising to me, which is that we asked all these communities, is abortion something that should be between a woman and her doctor without government interference? Is essentially the question, the statement. And every one of these communities was over 50% yes.
Every one
of them. And that includes these evangelical communities and the LDS communities. And we were really surprised by that because, and at first you'd think like, oh, I know why, because you just are asking the liberal people in those communities. And it's like, no, because when you look at other questions in here that are clearly meant to pull this is a conservative idea, they pop. They're like, yep, that's a conservative point of view. That's a conservative place. That's what they think. But on abortion, it was different. And it was truly remarkable that the fact that there was so much agreement on that issue.
And just to put a pin on this, you couldn't even do that anyway. Just find the liberals.
Well, it's
among the evangelical hubs and the LDS.
There's always this concern when there's a poll that like, well, sure, but you just talked to the wrong people, right? That's why you just talked to the wrong people. But then you look at the poll, it's like, well, I don't like right people, wrong people, but obviously when you look at these other questions, like, no, this is a pretty good representative sample, but this place is like. So
let's get to one of those other questions. Yep. Second Amendment.
Yeah.
Big I didn't say guns. I said Second Amendment.
Yeah, and it's like, is owning a gun central to what it means to be an American?
And that's think about that question. Is owning a gun central to being an American?
Yeah.
What did you learn?
So when you look at it nationally, it's about 50-50, which is, I mean, I guess, when you think about the fights we have over guns in this country, it's like, okay. But then you go into the communities and it's radically different from place to place. Some places you've got 60%, 70% agreeing with that idea. Other places it's down like 30%, 33%. Big cities, for instance, not big fans of guns. But you get out to like rural middle America, LDS, or evangelical communities or working class country. Yeah, owning a gun is part of what it means to be here.
And that's one of those questions on the conservative side that popped, and even so, which evidence that it's not just liberals you're talking to.
Exactly, yeah.
You still got that higher than 50% on abortion. The question should be a woman, her doctor, and no government interference.
And I will say, like, we had one question in that it was really like cultural liberal or cultural conservative. The healthiest environment for a child to grow up in is a working father and a mother staying at home to raise the child, which is like pretty much like this is the conservative idea of what a family is supposed to be. And on that question, all those communities popped, right? It was yes, evangelical communities said yes, LDS communities said yes, and then the big cities, urban suburbs, which are also very democratic, college towns, no, they did not agree with that statement.
Right.
So we were capturing that stuff. The differences are there on these cultural conservative questions. They just didn't show up on abortion, which is interesting.
What did the survey tell you about attitudes about government?
People aren't fans of government. So I will say, like, the thing that came out of
would also be kind of a surprise.
Well, the question, one question we asked people was about this kind of surprised me, is should we cut social programs in order to cut taxes? Right.
Okay.
That's one where I'm like, okay, I think these conservative communities are going to say,
here's the choice.
Like, yes, if that's the choice, yes, we're going to.
Where do you come down on this choice?
Nobody wanted to do that.
Nobody.
Again, like over 50% in every community, or where under 50% in every community agreed with that, which was interesting to me. So then you're like, oh, so this is a group of people that is kind of pro-government in some way, right? Or they don't want government cut. But there's another question that we asked, a statement that was like, the federal or government needs to do more to capture private malfeasance, or basically capture private misdoing by private companies. Nobody wanted that. Even the liberal communities were not in favor of the government stumping up enforcement over the private sector, which again was interesting to me. Like, and I think a lot of it goes to like, there is a lot of distrust. I mean, the one thing we did before this, we went around the country to 4 different places and asked people with these 25 words what they mean to them. We asked people about government. The word corrupt came up an awful lot with people, a lot.
So there is a embedded sort of suspicion, even if it's phrased in terms of a question about catching those who are exploiting the system or who are rigging it against you.
That really surprised me.
There's still reluctance to chase after them.
Even in the places that lean left, that was one of the things that really surprised me again in the survey. Yeah.
There are surprises in our country. We're going to continue to learn more about them. Segment 4 of The Takeout coming your way in just 1 second.
Am I optimistic about the next couple of years? I think it's going to be bumpy.
Welcome back to the Takeout. You know I love to nerd out. This is a nerdier of a kind of show that we do. There are times when we just nerd out. That's what happens. You're in this audience because you know that. You've been sufficiently warned, and you've bought in, and I thank you for that. Lunch is now concluded. It was fantastic. DuPont Italian Kitchen, we thank you. Dante Chinni is our guest. So this is an oversimplistic question, but I think it is important to have at least a conversation about. Looking at all this data, optimistic, pessimistic about our future?
I'm always optimistic about the future, and I do think, and I mean that in the most serious way. Like I do think in the end, we're going to figure this out. But am I optimistic about the next couple of years? I think it's going to be bumpy. I mean, I think it's just going to be very bumpy. I think we're at one of these hinge points in history. Parties are realigning. The economy has changed. Technology is changing very rapidly.
It's a very disruptive time.
It really is. And what does that mean? It means that we as a country are trying to figure out who the heck are we going to be? And like those conversations are hard. And like it's going to be, will it ultimately be okay? I think so. But like get ready for, bumpy decade or two.
And one of the things that came across to me looking at the data and your report about it is that there is this pretty deeply embedded question people are asking themselves. What does it mean to be an American?
Yep.
What is America? And do I fit in it anymore?
Yeah.
That feels pretty close to the bone.
Yeah. I mean, we did ask one question. One of the statements was, I feel like a stranger in my own country.
You asked that question.
We did. We asked people whether they agreed or disagreed, and we saw the same kind of movement. Again, the places that it's really a question about alienation. And you see it specifically in more rural communities and communities, again, like I'm not saying this is all about voting, but like communities that are more likely to vote for Donald Trump, higher Trump money or higher Trump percentages. Those places really feel that way. I mean, so there is this question of what it means to be an American and what is America. These are heavy, heavy, heavy questions. And people, and again, like you go to these communities, it makes sense. They have very different answers to like what it means to be an American and what they want the country to be for their kids. And like we'll resolve it one way or the other. But like the thing that makes the thing that I think is going to make things very bumpy is this. The country is pretty evenly divided on the blue-red axis, right? One way or the other. But there are these cleavages that we see in the data, these different kinds of community. Getting anything done in this country involves compromise.
Right.
And like when you ask these fundamental questions about what is America, what does it mean to be an American, these are not things people like to compromise on. These are things that people have very concrete views on and are not interested in. I mean, they might be interested in hearing what you have to say, but you're not going to convince them otherwise, right?
They're not interested in giving an inch.
Right. So what does that mean? Again, that's why I say like the next 10, 20 years, we're going to be hammering through this stuff, and it's going to be hard. But I think we'll get through it. I do. One of the efforts of this, one of the points of this project is we hope that in the end we find common ground. We think we can. There's a really interesting question that we asked for a statement. Americans have more in common than is generally believed. We asked people that.
Right.
Every one of these types agreed with that.
All 15.
All 15. Yes, Americans have more in common than is generally believed. They all agree with that. That's pretty positive.
That's
right?
hopeful.
That's a really hopeful point to take away from this. And some of the other things we talked about, the question on abortion, even though some people may disagree with it, the idea that like this hugely divisive issue, we kind of have made up our minds on it, really, when you get into the data. There's this question about there's a lot of distrust of the economic system in this country, and it comes from everybody. So there are areas of agreement. But even if you agree on the idea of like what's wrong, then comes the question of then what do we do about it? That's when things get tough.
Did you ask anything about what it means to be either an immigrant or how comfortable we are with more immigrants?
Yeah, so that was one thing that was, again, most immigration does not do well in this poll. We asked people, would the country be better off with more immigrants? Even the most liberal communities were like, no.
No. Really?
Yeah. And I will say, like, looking at the data, they're probably wrong, frankly. Like, we're running out of workers. Like, we probably actually do need more immigration in this country. But they don't want to hear it. It is a really...
And is that even more profoundly prevalent in rural communities and
Yeah, I mean,
conservative
yes.
communities?
I mean, yeah. When you get to like places like working class country, there was one of the really interesting. We had a battery of questions where you asked them local important issues in your community versus what's important issues in the country. So, immigration in a lot of these communities where there are no immigrants, nobody had it ranked highly as a local issue.
As a local issue, right.
It's high in the Hispanic centers, but it's not high in like working class country, evangelical hubs. Evangelical hubs, I think it was only like 9% said it was one of the three most important issues. Nationally, 33% said it's one of the three most, and it moved from like fourth to like the second most important issue nationally behind inflation, which we know nobody likes to pay more for things. But like, that's interesting to me because it's like this is not something these people are dealing with in their daily lives. They're receiving messages about what's happening in the country, and they're responding to it.
If someone in my audience wants to find this data and look at it and see the pictures and see the results, where do they go?
Go to AmericanCommunities.org. Please do come by, read the survey, read the analysis, see what you have to say. There are also these videos we have on there. We went around and asked people 25 words, what these words mean to you. Things like democracy, liberal, conservative, work, and those are pretty interesting as well. Different people in different places. I think, look, the goal of everything we're doing here is to try to get people out of the bubbles. We started at the beginning about the bubbles. Right. I'm in a bubble, you're in a bubble, we're in a bubble. DC is maybe the bubble of all bubbles. The only way we're going to get out of this thing is by being able to get outside of the bubble at least a little bit. It doesn't mean you have to agree with everything the other side says, but you have to at least try to understand where they're coming from. Right. And we're hoping that's what this work does. We're hoping this work sheds light on the idea that people live in different places, see the world in different ways, differently than you do. And they need to see the way you see it, and you need to see the way they see it. And maybe when we start to do that, we can close some of these gaps.
It costs money to do this work at the level of depth and intensity that you do it. Where's the money come from?
Yeah, thank you. From our good friends at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who funded this work. The American Communities Project is based at Michigan State University, but with funding from Robert Wood Johnson. And I will say they have been just a terrific partner. And they are very involved in this. Like, sometimes you get a grant. I've gotten a few grants, and somebody just gives you money and says, bye. They're really interested in this, and they've been working with us. They helped devise the survey. We're going through results together.
And if you were to try to explain to my audience the goal or the goals, what would they be?
So this is the first of 3 surveys. We're going to do one of these a year, and theoretically, this is the survey that tries to identify where the fault lines are. The second one goes a little further and tries to understand root causes, and the third one tries to find where's the common ground, where can we build bridges. That's the goal. Over time, will we get there? I mean, stay tuned. We're working on it. Yeah.
Right. But the 3-step process is identify, dig deeper, and then try to see if there's a way to take that to a level of reconciliation.
Yeah. That's why I will say the one thing that was really positive out of this survey was we found some of these issues that really we thought would be divisive weren't. So for us, even this first thing was like identifying the fault lines. It's like, oh, look, there's a little bit of hope here. There's a little bit of hope here. There's some areas where there's already some agreement. That was a good sign.
Venn diagrams of hope. They can be found, ladies and gentlemen. Dante Chinni has been our special guest. That concludes the Takeout. Stay tuned for the Takeout Outtake Especial. We'll see you next week. In our last 45 seconds, I want to have a brief conversation about Godfather 3.
Ha! No.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. DuPont Italian Kitchen has been our host restaurant. We thank them very much for that. Food was excellent. Dante Chinni is our special guest. So we did all the stuff on the surveys and the data, and we're going to have some fun here. So
all right.
One of the things that we do to have fun in this fun and games segment is we ask 3 questions. The show's been going on for now 7 years, I'm happy to say. And almost everyone has taken these questions. Take them whichever order you prefer, and feel free to lean into the answers.
Absolutely.
Most influential book in your life and why? All-time favorite movie. One way to think about that is if you're scrolling through whatever device you're scrolling through and you see this movie, you always stop. And if you're on a long flight or a long drive, Dante, and you're really going to enjoy some music, what music, artist, or genre is that most likely to be?
Wow. Okay. These are good questions.
That's why I like them.
So the first question, let's go in order. Book. I think the book that was most influential to me, and there's a lot of books I love,
course.
but like, there's this book by Daniel Boorstin called The Image. Mm-hmm. It is, I think, from the late 60s, early 70s. I read it in college, and it was really mind-blowing. It was kind of the discussion of how culture interacts with people and politics, and how it probably ended up really setting me on the course I'm on. Mm-hmm. It's a terrific book, and look, it's dated, but it's still like, if you find it anywhere, it's because I think it's been in print for a long time. It's a well-known book.
Someone I know, Ron Brownstein, a good friend of mine, a friend of this show, argues, and he's not the only one, but he argues aggressively that culture leads politics.
Oh yeah. He's correct. I mean,
politics catches up, and culture's way out ahead.
Everything we did to build these, there were these types. There's no politics in there. For us, politics is the lagging indicator. Mm-hmm. Economics, culture, these are the things that kind of develop your psyche, who you are. Right. And then politics ends up being like, how do you respond to it?
Right, and how it flows through you.
Yeah. And so the image, read The Image, is excellent.
Movie,
I love movies, man. So that's really hard for me. And it depends on the night. I mean, all right. So, okay, I'm going to do a couple.
Go a couple, please.
Okay.
When we were emailing, you said most of the podcasts you listen to are about movies or sports.
Movies or sports.
Yeah.
So I love Martin Scorsese. So I love Goodfellas. Mm-hmm.
How can you not?
I do, and I love Godfather 1 and 2. Those are kind of standard issue responses, though. But I love The Big Lebowski.
Great.
One of my all-time faves.
The dude abides.
The dude definitely abides, and that era, and I do.
Sounds exhausting.
Going my Tarantino itch. Like I do, like I love Pulp Fiction, and I love Reservoir Dogs, mm-hmm. And like, let me see, one other one to just throw at you is I still will watch. Every time it's on, I will watch Shawshank, mm-hmm. and just I'll wherever it is, I'll jump in and be like, ooh.
Yep, exactly.
Oh, walk in the yard, I'm in.
Exactly.
Yep.
Music.
I'm a child of the '90s, so and I really am. I do like my daughter is studying jazz, so I'm into jazz a little bit, but like mostly I'm like a '90s head. So like I love the Replacements. Mm-hmm. I saw them 3 times. Pavement. I totally love Pavement.
Wow.
I'm a big Pavement
First time
head.
That's ever been mentioned in 7 years.
I'm a big Pavement head, and then I do like this. Like look, everybody loves the Rolling Stones and things like that. But like for the most part, like music from the late '80s, early '90s. So Replacements, Pavement, the Pixies, and occasionally like I've been listening to a lot of Talking Heads lately because I've seen the anniversary of Stop Making Sense.
Yes.
So I've been listening to that on repeat for the last couple of weeks.
Excellent. In our last 45 seconds, I want to have a brief conversation about Godfather 3.
No. Very brief, I hope, right?
I believe it is not in anywhere close to 1 and 2, but
not.
It is, I believe, criminally disregarded. It's not a bad movie as people say it is.
Yeah, I mean, so let's just go
It
there.
suffers by comparison.
Let's just go there.
Yeah.
I agree. I think it's not, if you were to just see it as a movie, it's like, that was a pretty good movie.
That's exactly right.
Sofia
you give it a 7.
Coppola, who I think is a tremendous director.
Yes, terrible actress.
Yeah. And that movie, if they got
Winona Ryder. It
suffered
from miscasting.
They were supposed to have Winona Ryder. If they'd got Winona Ryder,
yeah,
would have been a different movie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And people did not like the tortured Michael Corleone. That's okay with me. I'm okay. I thought that was believable to me.
Yeah, I was okay with that part
of it.
Oh, yeah, because
he's
getting near the end.
Not macho enough and all that sort of stuff. That was okay with me. I think you look at that movie in isolation, it's a 7 and a 7.5, which is a solid movie. It just doesn't compare with the first two, but I think it's unfairly maligned.
I think that's right, and I do think it's like, so. Oh God, we don't need to do all this. All right, the way that Michael dies compared to the way that Vito dies, I mean. Michael, because of where he's at in his life, is bound to have some of the things he's having in that movie.
Right.
He's older. He's looking back on his life. Vito never had that for a whole bunch of other reasons.
No.
Anyway, so I buy your point completely on there. Yeah.
That's that, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you next week. Major's Movie Corner.